Hello, and welcome back to the Live Label Free podcast, and welcome to part two of my chat with Laurence, the chair and research lead of Eating Disorders Neurodiversity Australia, EDNA. If you have not yet listened to part one of this conversation with Laurence, I do recommend you listen to that one first, as many of the topics discussed today will be an extension and an elaboration of what we talked about in part one. Now, if you have already listened to part one, you know Laurence and I exchanged stories, and more specifically, we exchanged stories about how harmful traditional eating disorder treatment was for us as neurodivergent individuals. I've talked quite a bit about interoception on the podcast before, and we dive into this in today's episode, but Laurence also talks about a lesser known term, which is exteroception, so the antagonist of interoception. We also talked about binge eating and masking, and in today's episode, we dive into a few more key terms and concepts, including executive functioning and alexithymia. Lastly, Laurence shares several autistic traits that were labeled as ED behaviors and pulls back the curtain on some traumatic stories in which she was gaslit in treatment. Basically, the conversation you're about to listen to is absolutely packed with value, so if you get anything out of it at all, we would love it if you could share this episode with a friend, with a loved one, or on Instagram. And if you do share on Instagram, be sure to tag both me at LiveLabelFree and EDNA at EDNEUROAUS so we can connect and ultimately make this more of a conversation. Before diving in, I want to remind you that my new online bookstore, livelabelfreebooks.com, is here. And as I've said before, I'm super excited about this new branch of my business as it allows me to ship globally at super affordable prices. It also supports small print companies that aren't under the capitalist umbrella, which is Amazon, and it provides me with more flexibility when it comes to book formatting. And yeah, the best part is that you can get discounts by bundling books. You can also sign up for the Rainbow Girl audiobook waitlist, which is also very exciting as I am almost done recording the audiobook. Just head over to livelabelfreebooks.com to learn more, and without further ado, let's dive into today's episode with Laurence.
Gotta put one foot in front of the other, and you'll be around the corner soon.
Welcome to Live Label Free, the podcast, where you'll learn to let go of limiting labels and embrace your unique brain. As my mom says so beautifully in her song,
Fear is a heavy load to carry.
which is why on this podcast, you'll learn the scientific links between neurodiversity and eating disorders, giving you a deeper understanding of how you can face your fears and become truly free. Together, you and me, we will keep putting
One foot in front of the other.
I've been looking forward to this chat since we finished part one, actually. And just with all the wonderful feedback we got on that episode, I'm like, I can't wait to record part two. So yeah, in our last conversation, you shared your experience with neurodivergence. You shared your experience with eating disorders. You shared how they both overlap, and we both exchanged loads of anecdotes illustrating the prevalent link. And you also shared some key terms, including interoception, exteroception, masking, and I know there were a few more you wanted to share about. And I believe these included executive functioning and alexithymia specifically. So can you start off by sharing with our listeners what executive functioning is and how this is related to neurodivergence and eating disorders?
So one thing that I didn't get to touch base on last time is executive functioning. Executive functioning issues are most so related to ADHD, which is also correlated with a much higher risk of developing eating disorders. And oftentimes autism and ADHD can co-occur as it does for me. So executive functioning refers essentially to aspects of cognitive processing related to memory, especially short-term memory, like where are my keys, where is my wallet, things like that. Did I close
Yes.
the door? Where's my car? Um,
Yeah,
and
the
also,
popular one
yeah,
the popular one for me is, where are my sunglasses? Who took my sunglasses? Livia, they're on your head.
yeah, that's
Yeah.
happening to me. Or I enter a room and I'm like, it's dark in here, and then people look at me and like, why don't you wear your
Yeah.
sunglasses? And I had forgotten about that. Yeah. So another aspect of executive functioning is motivation and um, ability to prioritize tasks and organization as well. So essentially, that can affect eating in terms of going grocery shopping, so that you don't have the motivation. You'll like task initiation paralysis when you don't have the motivation to
Hmm.
start something because either you're doing something else or you are in a procrastinating mood, and as well just forgetting
Yeah.
or not being able to organize things to go grocery shopping, then come back home, then choose a recipe and then cook.
Yeah.
I mean, meal
So
preparation
many
can
steps. So many steps.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And neurotypical people, they tend to do that naturally, but for people who have ADHD, that can be a bit of a more of a challenging thing to do, and so they may struggle to actually engage in behaviors that like allow for feeding and eating. So it can be quite challenging, and I think that that has contributed to my eating disorder as well, like not being able to make a choice about what to eat, not being able to find the motivation to go grocery shopping, and then there's nothing in the fridge, so I might as well just not eat. I'll eat a bit more
Right.
tomorrow, not a big deal. And yeah, it's
Yeah.
then you never have like a stable kind of eating pattern.
Yeah, no, I resonate a lot with that. I mean, when I developed my eating disorder, I was very young. I was 11 and I still lived at home. So I mean, the fridge, it was never like, oh, I have to do grocery shopping. I have to do the cooking. It was done for me. And I mean, we talked last time in our chat about the Maudsley method and FBT and how traumatizing that can
Yeah.
be. But for me, it was more like when my parents would ask, like, Livia, what do you want to eat? Because there was still they knew that I was very stubborn in the sense that if they were just gonna make food without giving me kind of any choice of the matter, like I was more likely to resist it. So they'd often like ask me like,
Yeah.
"What do you want for breakfast? Oatmeal, cereal, or pancakes?" And then even that in and of itself would be like, I would go like, "Well, what's the best option?" Well, because I can't find a best option because the best option doesn't exist. I was like, I'm overwhelmed. I would have a meltdown or a panic attack, and they would be like, "Here we go." um. So, and I think
And
yeah,
it's really funny because I cannot cope when people tell me what to eat. So when people tell me what to do in general, and
yeah,
I'm like, yeah, I'm not gonna do it.
right. That's where the
It's
demand
PDA,
avoidance
right?
comes in too. Yeah,
Exactly. Yeah. But at the same time, if I don't have enough choices, then I'll feel I mean if I don't
you
have
feel
choices,
limited. You feel
I
restricted.
feel
Yeah,
limited. But then at the same time, if I have too much choices, I get paralyzed and I freeze because I cannot prioritize because of ADHD. So I freeze and I cannot
right,
make a decision. And then eating becomes like um a whole process that is
right,
exhausting and overwhelming of
right.
having to make decisions and then having somebody decide for you so you cannot do it, and then too many decisions and then somebody decides for you, and then you can never find the
Right.
right balance.
It's such a paradox because I often describe like I am constantly seeking stimulation everywhere. I'm like more, 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 but at the same time I'm like I'm way too overstimulated right now. Like just
Yeah,
put me in a hole so I can like decompress. And it's like
yeah.
trying to find that Goldilocks balance of like the stimulation has to be just right. And I think kind of
Yeah,
what you
exactly.
described is like we want choices in what we can eat because we want autonomy, but at the same time we don't want rules. We don't want someone saying you have to eat this. And, the
Hmm.
common autistic trait of I'm just going to eat the same thing every single day at the same time. I think, it's often perceived as rigid and problematic, but I think when you view it from this lens of like protection, it's an adaptation to, to
Exactly.
preserve brain energy so we don't have to make that choice in the future because it's already made and we made it ourselves. So it's like
Exactly.
autonomy
Yeah.
and avoiding the analysis paralysis. But of course, like the
Yeah.
moment it becomes a hindrance of I want to be able to eat more foods, but I can't because I'm stuck, then it's observing, okay, how can we bring curiosity into this to see how can we keep that safety while still, getting a bit uncomfortable so we can expand and actually live a life in which we're not enslaved to the rule we have created. So
Yeah.
yeah, I'm curious if you resonate with that.
Totally. I mean, yeah, it's always the analysis paralysis or the demand avoidance, and it's really hard to find something that is in the middle, like having the feeling of having made the decision, so you feel comfortable with it instead of having somebody telling you, then demand avoidance. So I think that's something that's not taken into consideration in treatment of eating disorders, and
Yeah,
it should definitely because it has an impact on treatment outcomes. And it has an
absolutely.
impact as well on how you're treated as a person with an eating disorder. For example, if you forget to do the homework for CBT, or if you if you resist the demands that are placed on you, like this is the meal plan and you need to eat this and this and this, and you're just not going to eat the meal plan or abide by it, not because you don't necessarily want it, just out of demand avoidance and being overwhelmed. And then sometimes they will give you a lot of choice, but then you cannot comply with that because you cannot make a decision and you freeze.
Right.
And that's often perceived as treatment resistance, and
Non-compliant.
you're
Yeah,
exactly, and you're kind of blamed for support needs that you have as an autistic or ADHD or and ADHD person. Instead of being supported, you get blamed, you get shamed to a certain degree, and you get guilted into, well, if you don't recover, then it's your fault because we're doing everything that we can. But actually, you're doing things that are counterproductive from the perspective of neurodivergence, and that's a problem.
right. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think you just described like one of those huge eating disorder behaviors, like that's actually an autistic trait. I mean, the demand avoidance, like the moment you say you have to follow the meal plan, you have to eat X, Y, Z, and then it's like our brain makes
The
that
moment you
automatic
say that is the
switch.
moment I don't follow it.
Yeah, exactly. And then it's like, is your eating disorder taking control over the situation? It's like, oh my fucking God. Like, can we just pretend like it's not some random ghost floating around the room the whole time? But yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, there are so many more, autistic traits and autistic preferences that in treatment are often immediately labeled as, oh, this is the eating disorder. So I'm wondering, can you share some more eating disorder behaviors that were invalidated almost, during your treatment and recovery that, I mean, the outcome probably would have been better if these were recognized and had almost there was compassion for these underlying autistic traits.
Yeah. So, I mean, I went to treatment a few times because I had like several relapses over the years. And so I experienced inpatient treatment quite often. Not often, but yeah, a few times. Let's say it that way.
More than the
So
normal
essentially,
person.
yeah,
Yeah.
like separating foods on the plate because I don't like
Hmm.
when tastes
When they're all mixed
match
up,
or
yeah. Sensory
mixed up.
overload.
Yeah. Exactly. Or eating alone because I don't like the when the foods of others they have strong smells, and I because I have like very heightened sensory processing for the hearing, so I have a hard time coping with the noises made by others using cutlery on the plates.
Oh my God, yeah.
I just it's really overwhelming for me. The chewing sound sometimes, especially if I'm tired, that's going to be worse. Cannot cope with that. And like being forced to engage in small talk and eye contact and having oftentimes they are having music in the background here in Australia during meal times. And I'm
Yeah.
like,
Not
no,
just in
please
Australia.
don't. And yeah, and it's weird because a lot of autistic people have eating disorders, and yet here we are, knowing that autistic people struggle with sounds most of the time, and yet putting the music in the background during like treatment, like what are you treating? Um,
Yeah. What are you
seriously.
what are you tweeting? Yeah, that's a good question. Sometimes I
Um,
wonder the same thing.
And so I would be very overwhelmed because of the sounds and all those things. So I wanted to eat alone, but that was never respected nor acknowledged as, a support needs that I had as a disabled person. Um, I mean, it was so bad at some point, that I was trying to use my noise canceling headset during meal times, at one facility I was in, and one of the nurses, I think it was the chief nurse or the head nurse, so the one in charge, she would prevent me from using my noise canceling headset, saying that it was against protocol. Um, and I explained that, I was not using it to be rude or weird, or I just needed it because I was sensitive to noise, which would cause me anxiety and was counterproductive to my recovery. And she said, well, it's against protocol, so you cannot use it. Well, the
Yeah,
first thing is that preventing a disabled person from using reasonable adjustments is against the law. It's
yeah,
the Disability Discrimination Act of 1992, and I mean, me using headphones to assist with my nose sensitivity is technically a reasonable adjustment under the Disability Discrimination Act. So that, I mean, arguably that would be against the law to do that in the first place.
yeah,
But then again, it's completely counterproductive to treatment or recovery because it caused me a lot of anxiety and distress during meal times, which is the opposite that you want if you want to help somebody in that situation.
right.
Another thing is that I was prevented from using my phone or my iPad during meal times, and I like sometimes to watch a documentary with my headset, so I'm not disturbed by other noises. I just have the the sound from the documentary, and that can distract me sometimes. It can help, and they don't allow that in
Hmm.
treatment facilities because it's
Yeah.
against protocol. Which is funny because they're always like, "Oh, to see people, they're not flexible. Cognition is not
It's like,
flexible."
right. It's like, who's being
You go in
fucking
treatment
inflexible here?
approaches, and every time you try to do something your way because it helps you cope better,
Right.
no, it's against protocol. Like, who's inflexible? Like, seriously.
Right. And honestly, I mean that word protocol or that phrase, it's the rules. I have become so incredibly allergic to that, like ever since treatment.
Yeah,
Because I
me too.
remember too, in treatment, I would ask things. Because I mean, we want answers to questions, we want to understand things. And I'm like, if you can give me a valid explanation for why this rule is in place, okay, then I'll follow it. Because then,
Yeah,
I'm part of this. But the moment they say it's the rules, that's going to elevate the likelihood of that demand avoidance manifesting because I'm like, if you don't even know why you're enforcing this, well, then why the hell would I even comply with it, right? And then also what you say about the noise canceling headphones and the documentaries and, having that actually help you eat and then them
yeah,
saying like, you can't do this, it's against protocol. Not only like even separate from that it's against the law, I'm like, it's just not the humane moral thing to do to make it
yeah,
actually harder for someone in treatment to eat just by saying it's protocol. And then it kind of goes back to that question, like, what are you trying to treat here? The eating disorder or them like not being sensory overloaded without wearing headphones? It's like,
yeah,
right, yeah.
exactly. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, that thing of like accusing us of being like rigid and things like that is
Mhm.
really funny because, I mean, put a mirror in front of them and they're exactly like,
Yeah,
they're the same, they have the same ways of thinking as the ways that they accuse us to be having,
right.
which is, I mean, it's absurd.
Yeah, and I think
So,
in part it's because many of the people in these treatment facilities, I don't think they even know what the hell they're doing half the time. Because like especially like maybe the therapists and the psychologists and the people who are trained professionals, like I do believe they have some degree of expertise and knowledge, but so often, I mean, I remember my parents just being flabbergasted by the people who were like giving the DBT and CBT lectures. They were like young 22-year-olds, like just out of college or whatever, being like educating us on like this is how you treat a problem behavior. And then like they had no idea what they were even talking about. They would just read their DBT textbook. But when you would ask them like what was the purpose or what was actually this about, they'd be like, "Oh, look at the textbook." Like they don't even know what they're talking about. So Yeah, and I think that's kind of
Especially problem
where,
behavior for who is it a behavior that's deemed problematic by a neurotypical person or by a neurodivergent person? And
right,
what's the underlying purpose of the behavior? Why is the behavior happening and why is it problematic? Is it who is it problematic for?
yeah,
Can it be deemed as adaptive in certain contexts and why and how? I mean, be curious about the behavior instead
right,
of just saying this is problem behavior, let's treat it this way, whatever. If it harms or it doesn't matter, just do it
yeah,
this way.
right,
But then we are flexible in our cognition, but they're not.
right, right. It's like if you're gonna tell us like we have to adopt, it's like you got to do the same thing. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, interpersonal relationships work both ways, right? But
Yeah, I
anyways,
mean,
um,
co-regulation, like that's the
yeah,
foundation of any kind of relationship. And I think especially when you're helping someone in such a vulnerable position with an eating disorder, like that co-regulation piece, that safety, that trust is just exponentially more important. And it's the very thing that is often lacking in treatment. So it's like if we go back to the roots, like we don't need any of this evidence-based shit. Like if we just go back to like what is the normal human thing to do, I think we'd go a long, long way.
yeah. There's a lot of research coming out these days about more human rights based kind of like psychotherapy and also um epistemic humility is essentially acknowledging that we may not know everything, especially if we don't have lived experience, and that's why it's important to ask and accept that others may know better than us or different ways
Right,
that may or may not be better or worse, and acknowledge that our knowledge is limited and that there are other ways of knowing that are just as valid as ours. And so if neurodivergent people work differently, then we should accept their testimony of it and not
right.
patronize them and speak over them. And
Yeah.
yeah, as is often the case in therapy for eating disorders.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's so ironic that stories of lived experience have been left out of the conversation and that we kind of depend on what the textbooks say. Well, if you kind of go back to the roots of the textbooks, these are written by people who don't have lived experience. So it's
Yeah,
like how is this even evidence? Like how do we even know this is valid if you don't even know, if you don't even have an experience of what you're even writing about? It's all based on assumptions and observations. And one of my favorite examples that I often think of is like, say you want to learn how to surf. And you have two options for like a surfing instructor. You have one person who's like read every single book on surfing. Like they just sit inside all day and read. How do you surf? How do you do the skills? But they've never surfed a day in their life. And then you have someone else who, maybe has read a few books, but he just spends most of his time surfing throughout the day. And then it's like, who would you want to learn from? The person who has only read about surfing or the person who actually does the thing every single day?
yeah,
It's like, in the end,
yeah,
you only learn how to do something. You only learn what works by actually working, by actually doing the thing. Yeah, so I
yeah.
just wanted to add that. Do you or your loved one feel at a loss when it comes to eating disorder recovery as an autistic person? Perhaps you've already tried countless treatment approaches only to be told your problems are too complex and you're just going to have to manage a disordered relationship with food for the rest of your life. If you resonate at all, I'm so excited to tell you about one-on-one coaching. As I read in my book Rainbow Girl, my approach to coaching is all about viewing you and your loved one as a whole, unique person, rather than a set of symptoms that needs to be solved. An eating disorder does not stand on its own, nor is it even at the root of the issue. It's simply a manifestation of many deeper elements, elements that we will unpack and be curious about together. One of these elements is, of course, being autistic. Through one-on-one coaching, you'll learn how to use your autistic traits to your advantage when it comes to challenging your eating disorder so you can live the life of freedom you so deserve. Or if you're a parent seeking guidance on how to best support your loved one, I will help you understand your child from my autistic perspective so you can show up in a way where they start to trust you rather than resist your loving efforts. Just listen to what one mother has to say about working with me. I'm a mom who was desperate to help my autistic daughter with anorexia. Through working with Livia, I have learned to understand my daughter in a way I never could before. Honestly, nothing is more fulfilling than providing others with what me and my family wished we knew and had when we were struggling. To get started on your journey to freedom, book a 30-minute consultation call with me by visiting the link livelabelfree.com/schedule. So that's livelabelfree.com/schedule. Now, let's get back to today's episode.
Another thing, neurodivergent trait that was pathologized and prevented, they prevented me from doing it is stimming. So stimming is self-stimulating behaviors such as like flapping your hands or rocking or repeating sounds over and over again, things like that that are essentially adaptive for autistic people, especially if we are overwhelmed in terms of the senses. It's very important for self-regulation, and
Mhm.
yet it was deemed as, the typical, I want to burn calories, so I'm engaging in those behaviors.
Yeah,
It's the eating disorder talking.
right.
And it wasn't. It was just me being autistic and needing to stim in order to self-regulate.
Yeah.
But I was pathologized all the time, and I would be prevented from doing it because obviously it was not acceptable according to protocol. In
Right.
again,
Right. Yeah, I
um,
mean, yet if I may add to that, I think, kind of going back to asking like what would the normal human moral thing to do would be like in this case, instead of immediately labeling it, oh, it's this, you're doing it for this reason. I think what if you, again, co-regulation, had a conversation with this person, asking them, giving them space to be curious about where this is coming from, because that way you build
mhm,
that trust, you build that safe space for them to kind of see or understand like, oh, I'm actually being validated here, like someone's actually interested in my motivation for this, and that can invite the individual also to be more curious about exploring what kind of function or what's the purpose of the behavior. Are there alternative behaviors that could serve the same purpose, instead of immediately saying,
mhm.
this is it, you're not allowed to do it? Because as we all know, the moment you stamp a label on it and say like you're not allowed to do this, like we talked about before, that's
Yeah,
make it more likely for us to do it. So yeah, do you have
yeah.
any other examples you want to share?
Like eating the same foods for prolonged periods of time. That was often pathologized as the eating disorder talking again.
Hmm.
It was just autistic me trying to self-regulate. Yeah,
Yeah.
again, it's against protocol.
Right.
Now I have some probably less, a bit more serious and less funny, between parentheses, anecdote here. It's quite traumatic. I mean, from my perspective, it was quite traumatic, and I'm still quite unsteady about sharing it. But I think
Hmm.
it's important that people know that this is happening still to this day, and how it how it can be traumatic for autistic people is that one day I was in hospital inpatient and I had a severe hypoglycemic episode. So that means that your blood sugar drops pretty low and you become drowsy and
Hmm.
eventually unresponsive. So I was not to the point where I wasn't responsive, but I was getting there. I was getting extremely drowsy and not responding as much as I should.
Hmm.
And some nurses came around and addressed that with an injection of glucose in my veins. But while I was not feeling very well, one of the nurses that was taking care of me at the time, I could hear them saying something along the lines of, "Why do we even like help people like this?" Which was pretty shocking.
Hmm.
Um, and it makes you feel very unsafe.
Yeah.
Um, because you're like, well, if those people don't want to take care of people like me, then how do I know that they're taking care of me in the way that they should? Like,
Right.
will they let me die, or with the? Well, I mean, it comes to the point where you actually become very unsafe within
Hmm.
that environment, and that was pretty traumatic. And actually, one of the other nurses that was there at the time said that she came to me afterwards and she told me she felt that was very unprofessional and uncalled for, well, from the other nurse to have said that.
Yeah.
And so she wrote it in my clinical records in case I wanted to file a complaint later,
Hmm.
so that there will be actually a record of that having happened, and
Yeah.
not just me saying things. And so I filed a complaint with the Health Practitioner Regulation Agency here in Australia, and they looked at it and they said that, they found nothing wrong with how the nurse had
Right.
behaved. And
Right.
so essentially saying to a disabled patient who is unwell and struggling that, why do we even care for people like this?
Hmm.
Or what do we help people like this? I mean, apparently that's acceptable.
Right.
So that's an example of how discrimination runs deep in eating disorder care sometimes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, I can't even imagine, how traumatizing that must be because it's the epitome of gaslighting and invalidation.
Yep.
Because
Mm,
it's right. It's like if I'm in need of help from this person and this person is treating me like I'm the very person that's not supposed to be helped. It's like, what's wrong
yeah.
with me? And then it makes you question everything and who you are, and it just makes you more likely to, cling to the eating disorder, which is your like method and
Yep.
trusted safety net in this case. So yeah, I'm so
And
so
makes you
sorry that
lack
happened.
trust in healthcare professionals as well.
Oh,
That's the thing.
absolutely. Right. Because if it's like if I can't trust these experts, it's like who can I trust?
Yeah.
Which just makes, bouncing from treatment center to treatment center, it just makes everything worse because you just keep
Yeah.
losing more and more trust to the point where they eventually say, "Well, you've done so much treatment already, like you might as well just give up." And then it's like, okay, well, if
Yeah.
the person who's supposed to save me has given up, how like what am I supposed to do now? Um,
Exactly. That's
like
how it made me feel.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So, kind of, with all that said, before we transition into alexithymia, do you kind of want to share any more anecdotes or experiences, that you've kind of gained insights from throughout treatment?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think there is like a culture of patronizing and dismissing the voices of people with eating disorders in general, but even more so if they're autistic, I feel. For example, I was in hospital at some point and I read the clinical notes about me, and it was written patient with ASD or, patient with autism, even though I had expressed the fact that I wanted to be called autistic and that I felt that
Yeah.
the term ASD was offensive,
Mm-hmm.
and still they didn't care. They just wrote whatever in the notes, which,
Right.
there's a lot of research now at this point coming out showing that like autistic people don't enjoy being called that way and prefer
Right.
autistic or not using ASD and just autism.
Right, because
And yet
it
medical
pathologizes it. It's like
professionals will
saying
just
you have
patronize it.
like a disease, but it's like this
Yeah,
isn't a disease. It's an identity. It's me. Like
yeah,
you wouldn't
exactly.
say to someone, who identifies as queer or trans, oh, they have
Yeah,
queerness, they have transness. They're actually a boy or girl, but they believe that they have queerness. It's like that is just so
yeah,
invalidating.
it is. Yeah, if somebody called me, oh, you have bisexuality, I would be like,
Right.
what?
Right. Right.
I
It's
wouldn't be
crazy.
very happy.
Yeah,
Yeah, essentially.
exactly.
I think that in general there is a lack of accountability when it comes to like listening to people with a lived experience, and accountability in acknowledging that you can do harm to people even when you
Yeah.
don't intend to.
Right.
And it's important to actually take a step back and self-reflect and be able to say and raise your hands when you are called out for things that have harmed your patients.
Yeah.
Just be honest and have humility to recognize that yes, you may have been harming patients even though it was not your intention. That doesn't mean that you're a bad practitioner or you're a bad
Right.
person. Like actually it will make you even more compassionate and a better practitioner by being able to take a step back and acknowledging that you've caused harm and pledge yourself to do better and listen to your patients in the future rather than just act very dismissive and just not listen to patients when they tell you those things. I know it can be very uncomfortable and it sucks when you realize that you've probably harmed your patients, even though that wasn't your intention. But it's important to acknowledge. And I think there is a lack of responsibility and accountability and humility in that sector, and that needs to change in the future.
I mean, I absolutely love that you brought that up, in saying that acknowledging that you don't know everything, you don't have all the answers, that actually makes you a much better practitioner than pretending like
Yes.
you know everything. And it reminds me of that quote of Socrates, right? True knowledge, or the only true wisdom is in knowing you know nothing. Because I
Yeah.
think the moment we say that and have that humility, we open our minds to, well, we open our entire being to being a constant learner. I mean, in my biography that I share everywhere in my books, it's like I'm a lifelong learner. Even with coaching and with my clients, like, and someone starts working with me, I will never say like, this is how we're gonna do things. This is the plan. This is how I always do things. It's like, no, you teach me. You guide me. Like, what are you struggling with? Where do you want to go? Let's go on this journey
Yeah.
together and let's learn together. Again, co-regulation, creating a relationship.
Exactly.
I mean, everything is about creating a relationship, not only with others, but with ourselves. Like that's how you gain trust. Because we trust we have relationships with and we want to develop relationships with people we trust. Like there's a reason we don't get in the car of a stranger because we don't trust this person, we don't know this person. And I
Yeah.
think it equally goes, for the relationship with ourselves. Like we have a hard time feeding ourselves and recovering from an eating disorder because we don't trust our body. We don't trust that our body's going to show up for us in a certain way or that it's going to feel the way we want it to. But I think when we go on this journey of curiosity and say, I'm willing to discover and learn what makes me feel best and how I can accommodate that, that's when the love comes. That's when the love grows and we can embrace
Yeah.
our true full autistic selves.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. And it's funny, I mean, it's a bit of a stretch, but I think it's relates somehow to what you just said, is that there's research coming out at the moment saying, I mean, showing that essentially um the relationship, the nature of the relationship between a therapist and their patients is more important in terms of treatment outcomes than the therapy modality itself.
Hmm.
So they did some tests and they could see from statistical analysis of treatment outcomes, and like they tested those variables, and they saw that regardless of what therapy is used, whether it's modalities CBT or DBT or FBT, regardless of the therapy modality, the best predictor of treatment outcome was the good or the bad relationship between the therapist and their patient. So like the interpersonal fiber is extremely important in psychotherapy and treatment, and like how your patient actually ends up in the process of therapy from eating disorders. And yet for neurodivergent people, it's hard to find a good fit with a therapist if they're always patronizing you.
But yeah, I mean, I think it really all does come back to that question of what's the moral human thing to do in this situation, and then following that.
Yeah,
Because I mean, that's how we've survived for centuries is by creating true
yeah,
relationships. So I mean, we can have all these labels like therapy and therapy treatments and evidence-based this and that. But it's like I think the reason why many of these treatment modalities don't work is because they take us away from doing the more human thing, which is ultimately
yeah,
that's loving energy, which I mean, love is the greatest force of all. And I think we are taken away from that when we try and seek answers outside of the answers inherently in our heart we all possess, I believe, unless you're a psychopath that starts world wars, but that's a whole different story. Um,
yeah.
so yeah, thank you so much for sharing those anecdotes and kind of those eating disorder behaviors that were, I mean, the autistic traits that were seen as eating disorder behaviors. I think this is such an important conversation. And I think it validates a lot of people listening, as well as like the parents of autistic children with eating disorders, because it helps them be compassionate and understanding of like, oh, this behavior isn't actually problematic. Like, what if we invited curiosity and looked at this from a different perspective so we can accommodate them, help them feel more safe, so they can better trust us, so they're actually more likely to recover. So yeah, thanks again so much for sharing that. Um,
Mhm.
Kind of going off of like all of that and gaining trust in our body and um I guess interpreting internal signals. I'd like
Yeah.
to transition into alexithymia. Can you kind of share with our listeners what is that and how is that related to neurodivergence and eating disorders?
Sure. So alexithymia refers to difficulties appraising, integrating, and making sense of our feelings and emotions. So it's very much based in interoceptive awareness, which we have discussed last time.
Yes.
So for example, somebody that is struggling with alexithymia may perceive um, like certain sensory aspects as emotions or be confused about why or how they're feeling emotionally. So, for example, you can have struggle with knowing whether you're overloaded by the lights or the smells or the sounds, or if you're angry or hungry and irritated, and you're not sure which one is which, and it's a bit of a mismatch, and you're very confused about how you feel. And sometimes when people ask you, how do you feel? You don't know how to answer,
Right.
which happens to me a lot. Like
Oh
sometimes
yeah.
people ask me, so how do you feel? And I'm like, I think to myself, how do I feel? And
Yeah.
I don't know. And sometimes I just feel like answering the person's saying, well, I'm sorry, but I don't know how I feel.
Right.
But I realize that this can be a bit weird for neurotypicals. So I just say, I'm fine, thank you,
Right.
instead.
Right. It's that like very common thing of when someone asks you, "How are you?" and you just say, "I'm good," because that's what you're supposed to say. And
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
I have the habit, which I think many people do, of the autistic oversharing, in which I'll be like, "Yeah, actually, I'm really struggling today. I have all these deadlines," and they'll look at me like, "That's not what you're supposed to say. You're just supposed to say you're good and then move on." Now, like, what do
Yeah,
I have to say? And it's like,
yeah,
well, like you think we script and plan conversations, well, clearly you're not prepared. It's
yeah,
hilarious. Yeah.
it is, yeah. And I think that alexithymia as well relate to eating disorders because you cannot really like you mix sensory sensation with emotions. And so sometimes you can feel like you're hungry, but you're not really, I mean, you're not hungry, you're actually irritated or
Right.
overloaded by sounds, overloaded by thoughts. And yeah, it can lead to binge eating, for example, or
Yeah.
like what people call emotional eating.
Yep.
I know some people don't like the term, so I'm just referring to it that way, but I acknowledge that this may not be the best expression for everyone.
Yeah. No, I mean, I like that you brought up the binge eating piece because I think we've been talking a lot about, anorexia symptoms and the restriction and not eating because of analysis paralysis. But kind of
Hmm.
like we talked about last time about, how binge eating can be a really big misunderstood struggle, like just eating so much until you feel so sick and so full. Like that can also have to do with not knowing what the fullness feels like, not knowing what the satisfaction feels like. And
Yeah,
I think that analysis paralysis can also go the other way of like, I can't choose what to eat. I don't know what to eat. So I'll just eat everything in my kitchen so then I don't have to choose either. And then it leads
yeah,
to that thing of feeling so full and so sick. So yeah, I mean, that skill, I guess, is something really we have to develop. And I mean, like I say, we are all lifelong learners. I think it's so important to also have humility within myself, and other eating disorder coaches. I think it's such an act of courage when they say, I'm recovered from this illness, an eating disorder, or, I've recovered from binge eating, I've recovered from anorexia, but I am not immune to, still having problems with food sometimes. Like I
yeah,
overeat sometimes, I undereat sometimes, and then the next day it's like, yeah, you did something yesterday that your body doesn't totally agree with. Now we're going to make up for it kind of thing. And then again, it comes back to, oh, that's interesting. How can I learn from this? How can I have curiosity around this and just keep
yeah,
improving as a person? Because if we had all the answers, if we knew the perfect way to live, there would literally be no point in living life. Because I think that,
yeah,
there's
pretty much.
so many books about like finding your purpose in life. And I think one of my answers is like learning, discovering, constantly. So yeah.
And like purpose is not necessarily an endpoint either. It
Right.
can be a journey. And
Yes.
people oftentimes I think of like finding one's purpose is like an endpoint. It's like that's it. I found my purpose. But
Right.
I found my purpose like hundreds of times in my life and I might still change. So, I mean,
Right.
but
Right.
finding purpose is not something that has an endpoint. It's a journey, I feel. And as you
Yes.
said, it's a journey that's based in learning and unlearning as well, because people think about like they always talk about learning and learning and learning, but what there is a lot of unlearning and sometimes relearning that's
Yeah.
involved.
I love that you brought that up with the purpose and how it's constantly evolving because I mean, when I was deep in my eating disorder, I thought that was my purpose. And then it was
Yeah.
like when I was recovering from that, it was unlearning those habits and those behaviors and learning, well, what can I invite into my life that's going to give me more purpose and more fulfillment, and especially what's going to actually contribute beyond me? Because an eating disorder, it traps you in this little tiny world of like it's like if I have this, I'm safe, I'm safe. But like
Yeah.
it doesn't actually do anything for anyone else. It just actually hurts other people. Whereas when you recover and, discover, oh wow,
And,
like
and it hurts you as
yeah,
primarily
right.
as the
And like
person suffering from it.
I think that's the beauty in the work that we both do is we've turned our mess into a message. Like you, working for EDNA, me writing books and coaching, and us just having this conversation that people can listen to and gain insight from. I mean, this
Yeah.
in and of
I mean, I'm
itself,
still struggling, but yeah,
right? But
I'm
it's like you
working
don't,
on it,
but
but I'm
right.
learning at the same time.
I mean, I'm still struggling with so many things. Like yesterday, I had a podcast interview with Louise from Neurodivergent Lou, and we were just talking about burnout and the autistic tendency to constantly
I'm
overwork,
burnt
right?
out all the time.
Yeah, and like numbing myself in working, like
Yeah.
feeling, oh, as long as I'm working, as
Oh,
long
I
as
do
I'm
that too. Yeah.
posting, then I am
Yeah.
productive. But it's like that maybe the more productive thing to do right now is just go to rest and read a book.
Yeah.
So that's something, I'm still trying to be curious about of like, oh, what are my boundaries around energy and time and space and what space do I need, to show up in the best way? Again, it all
Yeah.
comes back to learning and discovery. So I'm really glad,
Yeah.
we brought this up because this goes beyond just eating disorders. It goes for all aspects of life. Um,
Yeah. Definitely.
so yeah, so do you want to share anything else about alexithymia or would you want to move on to the next question?
I think that pretty much summarizes the aspect of being confused about your sensory input and then having that have impact on how you feel in terms of emotions and being confused about that, and then having issues with your eating behaviors and feeding behaviors around emotional eating between parentheses and binge eating. I think that's the main message out of it.
Wonderful. Well, speaking of main messages, do you have any further words of wisdom for anyone currently struggling with an eating disorder while being neurodivergent?
Yeah, sure. I think that what has put me on the way to recovery, even though I'm still struggling to this day. But I acknowledge that I'm feeling a lot better within myself. Even though I'm still struggling, I'm feeling within myself much better than I was a few years ago. I would say that the main thing is like realizing that there's nothing inherently broken or wrong with you. And that your struggles are valid as a disabled person, and you deserve to have your support needs acknowledged, validated, and met. So don't be afraid to speak up and self-advocate if you feel that your needs are not taken seriously nor accommodated. You are allowed to take space and be loud, even though people tell you that you're too much and that you
Yeah.
have too much strong opinions and that you're too expressive. That doesn't matter. What matters is that you express yourself the way you want and that you are able to have your support needs met. You're not lazy for attending to your well-being. Like it's not unproductive to engage in self-care. It's actually quite the opposite. And you are worthy the way you are, even though you struggle in life with things.
I love that. That is absolutely beautiful and just such a wonderful way to wrap this up because again, it all comes back to giving ourselves permission, giving ourselves compassion to be who we are, to express ourselves in the way we are. And I think the more we allow ourselves to do that, the closer we come to, discovering who we are truly inside. And it also helps us to learn more about ourselves because you can only learn when you're honest about who you are and what you even want to learn in the first place. So thank you again, Laurence, so much for
No worries.
coming back on the podcast to record part two. To everyone listening, I mean, if you have not yet listened to part one, obviously super, super valuable
Listen to it.
conversation. And yeah, I mean, again, thanks so much. I can't thank you enough. I always just
Thank you.
love chatting with you. So, in case, people want to learn more about you, or get in touch, I know we mentioned it in the last episode, but can you kind of repeat that for everyone listening?
So I'm the chair of a not-for-profit organization, which is called Eating Disorders Neurodiversity Australia. So you can add to our website, which Livia will share
Yes, I
because
will.
spelling is not the greatest asset in life. Um, and then on the website there is a contact form, or you can email us as well. So all the details will be shared on our website if needed.
Yes. Yes, and that will indeed, like Laurence so beautifully said, will all be in the show notes so that we don't make any letter mistakes while saying it out loud.
Yeah,
Yeah, because
exactly.
even when I read from a script, I'm like, EDNA, and like, I'll like make sure I'm saying it right. And I'm like, I can always speed this up if I talk too slowly.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful thing about editing. But yeah, again, thank you, Laurence, for coming on the podcast. Thank you everyone for listening, and I will chat with you all in the next episode. Bye bye for now.
Just one foot in front of the other, and you'll see around the corner soon.
This podcast has been recorded by your host, Liv. This podcast has been edited by my small but mighty Live Label Free team, and the beautiful song One Foot in Front of the Other that you are now listening to was written and recorded by my beautiful mom, Louise Alexandra. I am so grateful for my team and everyone who supports Live Label Free. Together, we are always stronger.